I was going to talk about Combine a little bit today, but it's just too big of a topic to whittle it down to something short. We'll talk about developing for iOS 13 and supporting iOS 12 in the same project, or get Swifty, as I like to call it. Here's our roadmap for today. It's pretty brief. I've just taken some screenshots of the process. So we'll create a new project. We'll change our deployment target and deployment info. We'll add the framework, SwiftUI, and then we'll make the necessary changes to our app delegate. We have a new thing we have to deal with called scene delegate. I apologize for this, but we'll do a little interface builder work, but sort of necessary for this example. I've actually flipped these last two, or the SwiftUI view and the present UI hosting slides, just to make it a little more clear, and then we'll look at our screenshot of our example app. And I can show you the actual thing if you want on my iPad. So we'll make a new project. We'll switch from SwiftUI and select storyboard. This will give us a good starting point for an app, just to kind of pretend that we're taking an existing app and modifying it and bolting SwiftUI onto it. The first thing we'll go in is change the deployment target from 13 dot whatever to 12. And I think we all know where to do that. And then we'll go to deployment info and we'll change that to iOS 12 as well. And at this point, we have an app that has a ton of errors and won't compile on iOS 12. The next step, this will not get it working on iOS 12 yet, but it's a necessary step while we're on the screen. We'll go ahead and include SwiftUI framework. We don't need to embed it. It won't let us embed and sign, so try that. Your mileage may vary. So now what we'll start doing is modifying our delegate so that the app will actually run on iOS 12. Because at this point, we just have a ton of errors, maybe like, I don't know, for a template app, maybe a dozen compile errors at this point. There are two new methods here that get added, and these have to do with that new scene delegate, and these are in our app delegate. So we just need to wrap those and say, hey, only use this as if this is iOS 13. And this will knock out a ton of compilation errors right here. Then we'll go to our scene delegate. We'll do something very similar, except I had to get this to work, I had to wrap the entire class. A peculiarity of like how the compiler works is you can't wrap that import UI kit, but you can wrap the rest of that class. And then that gets rid of the remainder of our compilation errors. And this is our scene delegate. I've made no other changes to this scene delegate, but this is where you'd want to, say if you had an environment object, you would want to inject that here if you wanted it to exist throughout the entire app. And now interface builder, I should have had people cover their eyes if they needed to during this part. But I just added a button, and then we'll go into the next view and we'll add an action to that button. And here, this is a very complex view controller here. It just has, the only thing we have in it is this button touch up inside action. Once again, we're gonna wrap that, if I can, import SwiftUI, and then make sure we're running on iOS 13. If we can, what we'll do is we'll present this UI hosting controller and we'll pass it our SwiftUI view, which we're gonna look at in just a moment here. So if we're on iOS 13, we tap the button, it shows that. If they're on iOS 12, it'll just print iOS 12. So if they're on device, they'll have no idea that that view is there or needs to be there. And don't forget your end if statement at the end of that, otherwise it won't do you any good. And then finally, we're in our SwiftUI view. And we'll just make a list of 1,000 items where it says hello at the top, or actually it says hello on the list and then SwiftUI at the top. We hit compile. I think that's a 5S on the left. That 5S, like if you tap that button, nothing happens except for printing. And then if you run on a iOS 13 and up device, tap the button, you get the SwiftUI view presented to you. Part of the reason I wanted to cover this, I've had a number of people ask me, it's like, I've had people who are non-iOS people but technical be astounded that you could have SwiftUI in the same project as UIKit. It's like, yeah, that's kind of like the whole idea. In fact, it won't work without that, right? Because that's the entire way it works. But then that you can do this as well seems to be seems to be shocking to people, but if you look at those tools that I was using for this is the same stuff you'd be using for, say, porting an iPad app to Mac OS, because you're going to have to check what OS you're on, and your code's going to get pretty ugly after a while, but you will have these very discrete pieces that eventually you can just get rid of all those checks, like sometime next year, right? I wanted to show this graph again. I showed it last time I was here. This is the old graph, but notice the red there. Down here, these were like the months in 2018 and the adoption rates for iOS 12. But the red there is about where we're at today. Like right here is where we're at today on iOS 13. And then I just have the line continue going. So if nobody else adopts iOS 13 for the next year, that's where it is right now. That's the Mixpanel numbers. My experience is that Mixpanel tends to be behind like a modern app. If you've been leaning towards using new frameworks, your numbers are going to be higher. There are probably a lot of apps are closing in on 80% already, which is that Pareto distribution, which we like. So that means that if you're making something and it's shipping in 2020, and you feel that SwiftUI is going to provide your team like value, and that you're playing around with it for that use is stable enough for you, I would strongly consider it, particularly if you don't need that support for that feature on iOS 12. And I'll hand it over to the next speaker with that.